Forgotten Voices of the Great War, 1915, from the Toll House Inn, Lancaster. Setting the scene. After the gas attack, they were reeling around, tearing at their throats, their faces black, while an RAMC sergeant stood by and, "Well, I've never seen a man look so despondent," he said. "Look at those poor bastards, and we can't do a thing for them." France had lost 10% of her territory to the German invasion, and a third of her industrial capacity. Nevertheless, French factories poured forth guns and munitions. British plants began tooling up for production quantities undreamt of before the war. Mistakes were predictable in so hasty a transition to a war economy. Optimistic productivity assumptions failed to be achieved, and standards of manufacture were alarmingly variable, particularly with regard to ammunition. A disagreeably high volume of Dutch shells were passed to the front. A total of 110 Allied divisions faced 100 German divisions in the west. In the east, 80 German and Austro-Hungarian divisions confronted 83 Russian divisions over a front that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Carpathian Mountains, more than twice as long as the Western Front. The lower ratio of troops to space, combined with the yawning gulf in professional ability, enabled the Germans to drive the Russians out of Poland, a Russian province since the Napoleonic Wars, and eventually overrun Serbia. Small steps. Russian pressure on the tottering Austro-Hungarian army was reduced, but the conquest of a great swathe of Eastern Europe availed Germany nothing. Russia remained in the war, and the British and French war economies began to win the battle of the factories. The Allies did not win on the battlefield, however, despite bringing to bear increasing numbers of soldiers. The British Expeditionary Force, which had reached a total of 10 divisions by the end of 1914, expanded to 37 by the end of 1915, including 2 Canadian divisions. The call for volunteers vastly exceeded the ability of the tiny pre-war army to train and equip, let alone command in battle. Veteran officers and NCOs were brought from retirement, but the heavy losses that the pre-war regulars suffered in 1914 were to blunt the efficiency of this brave, enthusiastic, but essentially amateur army. The Battle of Neuve Chapelle indicated that with a well-prepared artillery fire plan, the German trenches could be stormed. However, these were small-scale operations, limited both in the numbers of troops employed and the modesty of their objectives. Their aim was to advance little more than a mile. The story of 1915 is of progressively larger Allied assaults failing with ever-lengthening casualty lists. Poison gas raises its ugly head. The Germans tried one brief attack in the west that year. On April 22nd, they made the first effective use of poison gas to attack French and British positions at Ypres. The Allies condemned this as an atrocity, but hastened to produce their own chemical weapons. The attack was essentially an experimental raid, in that no follow-up troops were ready to exploit the gap created by the initial success of the gap. The German error was to be repeated by British and French forces later. The French opened a major offensive in Artois, on a 20-mile front from Vimy Ridge to Arras. On May 9, 1915, 20 French divisions were involved against just 4 German, but despite unprecedented artillery bombardments, the German defences proved impossible to break. Barbed wire obstructed the attackers' approach. Concealed machine guns swept the open approaches, and hidden batteries opened fire suddenly to cut down the French in no man's land. In a series of attacks that lasted into the summer, 100,000 French soldiers were killed. The French tried again in the autumn on an even greater scale, this time with major British participation. 18 French divisions were ordered to assault the German lines in the Champagne sector, supported by 700 guns. Australian and Indian troops appeared. Objectives up to 50 miles behind the German trenches were planned to be captured, but the lines barely advanced 5 miles. At the same time, another thrust at the Artois area involved 11 French and 5 British divisions. The Battle of Loos opened on September 25th and ended on October 8th, 1915. The German lines remained unbroken, despite the British use of gas and smoke. The slaughter of two British reserve divisions, with the loss of 8,000 men, helped end the career of the British Expeditionary Forces commander, Sir John French. He was replaced by the commander of the First Army, General Haig, on the French side. Joffre's reputation suffered, but endured. The major British and French diversion of 1915 was the attempt to defeat the Ottoman Empire, which joined Germany and Austro-Hungary in October 1914. An Allied naval attack at the Dardanelles on March 19, 1915 was beaten off. The next decision was to carry out a major assault by ground forces. The Gallipoli landings on April 25th, in which Australian troops took part at Anzac Cove, while British and French troops landed at Cape Helles. The Allied forces, including many Indian troops, won a limited beachhead and spent the rest of the year in trench warfare. The home front. Private S.C. Lang said, "I was walking down Camden High Street when 2 ladies approached and said, 'Why aren't you in the army with the boys?' So I said, 'I'm sorry, but I'm only 17. And one of them said, 'Oh, we've heard that one before. I suppose you're also doing work of national importance.' Then she put her hand in her bag and pulled out a feather. I raised a hand thinking she was going to strike me, and this feather was pushed up my nose. A sergeant came out of one of the shops and said, 'Did she call you a coward?' I said yes, and felt very indignant about it. He said, 'Well, come across the road to the drill hall and we'll soon prove that you aren't a coward.' I got into the drill hall and the sergeant asked me how old I was. I said I was 17, born in 1898. He then said, 'Get on the scales.' He then weighed me and took me round to see the doctor for a medical exam. I got back to the drill hall where there were 6 of us waiting, and the sergeant called out my name. I walked forward and thought, 'Oh, that's good, I'm not in.' Then the sergeant said, 'You're the only so-and-so that's passed out of this 6. I was astonished, because I told him I was only 17, and there I was, almost in the army. I went to the recruiting office, and the officer said something to me about king and country, and then he said, Raise your right hand and say, I will. Then he said, I'm extremely sorry I haven't got your shilling, but we'll let you have that later on. And to my amazement, I found I was being called Private S.C. Lamb. Private William Chapman, the Royal Army Medical Corps, is pictured right, having been promoted to lieutenant. Next morning, the new draft, 20 of us, had to parade in front of a sergeant major and a sergeant. Their purpose was to find out what we had been in civilian life, so that we'd be suitably placed in the army. So they started. What were you in Civvy Street? I was a butcher, Sergeant Major. You will be in the quartermaster's stores. What were you in Civvy Street? I was a clerk, Sergeant Major. You will be in the orderly room. Then he came to me. What were you in Civvy Street? I was a theological student, Sergeant Major. What's that? I was just a theological student, sir. They then walked away and had a little conference. Right, Chapman. Royal Army Medical Corps. They didn't know the difference between theological and biological. Broome Service King and Country. Gunner Frederick Broome, Royal Field Artillery. When the war broke out, I was 15 years of age, but I was already in the army. I went to France in August 1914 and was there through the retirement from Mons, the Battle of the Marne, and then the advance to Ypres. It was there that I caught enteric fever, typhoid, and I was invalided back to England. I went and visited my father, and he sent in my birth certificate. So I was discharged for having misstated my age on enlistment. I got a job in Civvy Street, and a few months after I was walking across Putney Bridge when I was accosted by 4 girls who gave me 3 white feathers. I explained to them that I had been in the army and had been discharged, and that I was still only 16 years of age, but they didn't believe me. By now, several people had collected round the girls who were giggling. I felt most uncomfortable and awfully embarrassed, and said something about how I had a good mind to chuck them into the Thames, and eventually broke off the conversation, feeling very humiliated. I finished the walk across the bridge, and there on the other side was the 37th London Territorial Association of the Royal Field Artillery. I walked straight in and rejoined the army. New hat and a baby. Kitty Eckersley, leather worker. So he went overseas, and I never saw him for 6 months. He sent word he was coming home on leave for Christmas. In the meantime, I'd given the work up at the mill. I'd heard there was a better job at a leather works, Noblet's Leather Works at Ardenshaw. So I went for the job and got it. It was a lot more money than I was getting. I was expected at work when he came home unexpectedly in January. Just before I set off, there was a loud knocking on the door, and a voice shouted, "Open the door, the Jerrys are here." My mother said, "It's Percy." I can tell his voice. And in he came, all mucky, straight from France. I didn't go to work. I stayed at home all the time he had his leave. But he was dirty, filthy in fact, even lousy. Mother said, "There's a tub in the back. You're not sleeping in one of my beds like that. Get them shirts and khaki off and I'll see what I can do." We found some of his old clothes and he had a good rest. He wanted to buy me a present, so we looked in a shop window and he bought me a lovely hat, but it was terribly dear, 19 and 11 pence. You could get a lovely hat then for 2 and 11. I'll never forget that hat. It was white felt with a big mauve feather all round the brim. It was gorgeous. I took him to the leather works and introduced him to Mr. Noblet himself, and everyone shook hands with him. How pleased and proud I was to show him off. Anyway, he went back on the Thursday night. I didn't go with him to the tram, but he said to a friend, "I'm afraid I'll never come back." Anyway, he went. Afterwards, I found out that I was pregnant and wrote and told him about it. Fortnight on, fortnight off. Mrs. M. Hall, munitions worker. I'd never been in a factory before. My brothers and my friends are in France, so a friend and me thought to ourselves, let's do something. So we wrote to London and asked for war work. We were directed to a munitions factory at Perivale in London. We had a health examination. Perfect eyesight, physically fit and strong. We had to be British born of British parents. 10 hours a day, no breaks, an hour for lunch, 8 AM until 6:30. All the shops were closed when we got home. I went into a butcher's shop to get some meat. I said, "That looks like a cat." He said, "It is," but I couldn't face that. Once or twice we heard, "Oh, so-and-so's gone. Perhaps she made a mistake and lost an eye." But there wasn't any big explosions during the 3 years I was there. We made little pellets, very innocent looking. But if there had been the slightest grit in those pellets, it would have been goodbye. We worked a fortnight on and a fortnight off. It was terribly hard, monotonous, but we had a purpose. I was working with sailors' wives from 3 ships that were torpedoed and sank, Aboukir, Cressy and Hogue, on September 22nd, 1914. It was pitiful to see them, so we sang to cheer them up. It was beautiful to listen to. After each day when we got home, we had a lovely good wash. The water was blood red and our skin was perfectly yellow. Right down through the body, legs and toenails even, perfectly yellow. In some people it caused a rash. It was a shame, because we were a bevy of beauties, you know. These girls objected very much to that. Women did an unbelievable job. Mrs. M. Hall, munitions worker. Your hair, if it was fair or brown, it went a beautiful gold. But if it was grey, it went grass green. It was over 12 months after we left the factory that the whole of the yellow came from our bodies. Washing wouldn't do anything. In fact, it only made it worse. Each day we really and truly worked as I've never seen women work like that in my life, before or since. It was just magic. We worked and we stood and we sat and we sang. If anyone had come into that factory, they would never have believed it, because we were such a happy band of women working amongst such treacherous conditions. And there was the cold. I'm certain I'd never known brass to be so cold as it was in those factory nights. But we were just one big happy family. It was amazing, and I shall never forget it as long as I live. The way those women worked and talked and chatted about their ordinary everyday experiences. Their boys at the front. But mind you, it was the boys at the front that we were worried about, and that's what made us work like that. I used to be in Kent quite a lot, and I used to see all the troop trains coming, the Red Cross on them, non-stop, night and day. I went to Chatham Hospital to see a brother of mine who was there from the front, and I saw all the soldiers come in from Hill 60. Never shall I forget the sight as long as I live. They were unhealthy, they were verminous, and they used to say, "It's hell." That was their words. Only a few more adjectives with it. there they were, soldiers lying in Chatham Hospital from that battle scene, and how grateful they were for a kindly word from their womenfolk. At the front, Private W. Underwood, 1st Canadian Division. I was given 7 days number 1 field punishment, which consists of being tied on a wagon wheel. You're spread eagled with the hub of the wheel in your back and your legs and wrists handcuffed to the wheel. You would do 2 hours up and 4 hours down for 7 days, day and night. And the cold. It was January 1915, a really cold month. And when they took you down, they had to rub you to get the circulation going in your limbs again. The only reason I was there was because I missed a roll call. Private George Hancock's, Princess Patricia's Light Infantry, Canadian Army. Our main casualties during the first tours were caused by enemy snipers, so a sniping section was formed in our regiment. These were almost entirely men who had been big game hunters and were crack shots with rifles. They were used to stalking, and if they had any kind of target at all, they were sure to hit it. They'd pick out spots where they could get good observation on the enemy lines and would watch a weak point in the parapet. For example, where it was shallow, as soon as a German went by, they would let him have it. It's very hard to say how many they got, but I think they paid the Germans quite well for any of our men they shot. There was quite a bit of rifle fire, not too much machine gun fire. We were not so much frightened of being killed and wounded as we were depressed by the conditions, as we all had thought we were going to fight a glorious war. Strange neighbours. Sergeant George Ashurst, 2nd Battalion, Lancashire Fusiliers. At right angles to the British line was a row of cottages in the Latuke sector. On the other side of the German line, about 20 yards away, was another row of cottages in German possession. A lane ran alongside both of them, and across the lane was a German barricade. It was decided that the row of cottages should be occupied. When we took them over, there was no opposition. Jerry was in his houses, and he didn't know till morning that we were in there. He may have risked a counter-attack, but he couldn't shell us because it was too near the German lines. He might have destroyed his own houses. There were 4 or 5 of us to each house. We had a backyard wall, but we didn't dare look over it. It was quiet. Jerry shouted to us, and we shouted back. One German shouted, "I know Manchester better than any of you." We used to argue like that. It was friendly. One day we were cooking our stew in a pan on the fire when Jerry decided to have a bit of fun. So he sat down and fired away at the bricks on top of our chimney. He knocked 1 or 2 down. Our stew went all over the kitchen floor. Jerry just laughed. He knew he'd picked the right time when the stew would be on. There was no real fighting. From the upstairs bedrooms, you could look down and watch Jerry. You could see over the barricade right into a schoolyard lower down, and one of our officers used to snipe away at Jerry in the yard. You could see their heads, and he used to try to get them. Strange situation. Sergeant George Ashurst, 2nd Battalion, Lancashire Fusiliers. One day the officer took a fellow upstairs and showed him the position where he stood, letting him look through the window, but this fellow dozed off. The officer caught him, severely warned him, then the officer caught him sleeping again, so he was sent away to be shot. I don't know whether the order was carried out, but that's what he went away for. A damn good soldier he was too. We felt sorry for the lad. Well, he wasn't a lad, he was an oldish fellow, about 50. 50. Then the Royal Engineers came into our house and started digging a tunnel below us. We were sure Jerry was doing the same thing. The engineers had enough stuff to blow all Paris up. Then the order came. Everybody keep well under cover. Then, whoosh! The whole barricade went up in blue flames, along with the end house where Jerry was. We saw a German lying wounded on top of an outhouse. Another German put a ladder against the outhouse, went up it, got the injured man on his shoulder and carried him away, while none of us fired a shot. The officer said, "Don't fire, boys, he deserves a medal like that." So we didn't. We let him walk away with his wounded fellow. He knew we were there. He could see us quite well. Things went a bit quiet after that, and soon afterwards we were relieved. The Battle of Neuve-Chapelle. Captain Philip Neame, 15th Field Company, Royal Engineers. I was constructing one of the first strong redoubts close to our front line, not far from Neuve-Chapelle, when my CO brought several people up to see this, amongst them Sir Henry Rawlinson, who commanded the corps. Actually, I'd known him in peacetime. He'd seen me win a point-to-point race on Salisbury Plain. Then, to my surprise, Haig came up, the commander of the First Army, in which we were. Whilst I was showing him round, the Germans started shelling. They did it every morning about 11 o'clock. One of Haig's staff officers nudged me and said, hurry up, let's get the army commander away." But Haig took no notice and went on walking around, even slower than before. And he asked me questions. Anyway, he went the whole way around this pretty large redoubt before walking slowly off down the trench, quite unmoved. Then the opening bombardment, which was most impressive that I heard throughout the war. It was quite brief and had only a limited amount of heavy artillery. It was nearly all field gun fire, but in the short period that it took place, the guns were fired at such a rapid rate that the noise was absolutely shattering. Where it was accurate against the German breastworks, it had a most decisive effect. Our advancing infantry suffered only moderate losses. The chief work before the battle was the preparation of assembly trenches for the infantry to shelter it immediately beforehand. This was because the whole of the infantry of the division had to crowd into the forward area on a narrow front, and so there had to be lines of very shallow trenches owing to the waterlogged nature of the ground. These were laid out and constructed under the supervision of sappers. Second Battle of Ypres, Gas. Private Alfred Bromfield, 2nd Battalion, Lancashire Regiment. April 22nd, 1915 is a day I shall always remember. I was in the bottom of a trench cooking breakfast, a couple of slices of bacon, sprinkling the cheese on top. I fried it up till it was bubbling, then turned it out on the bread. One of our chaps on lookout yelled, "Caw, look at the lyddite shells bursting along Jerry's trench." About 6 seconds later, the lookout shouted, "Blimey, it's not lyddite, it's gas." An officer gave the order, "Open, immediate rapid fire." We blazed away into the gas, not knowing if we were hitting anyone. Our rifles were getting hotter and hotter. Then an Irish medical officer named Captain Tyrrell, with a can of oil in his hand, ran down the trench, pouring the oil onto the rifle bolts. By the time the gas reached us, we had no protection at all, no such thing as gas masks. In those days, we had been tipped off that the only way to protect yourself was by urinating on a handkerchief or cap and covering your mouth with it. The firing suddenly stopped, and I realised the gas had gone right over the trench. Anyway, we stopped Jerry. We could see many of them lying dead or wounded, but I think the greatest havoc was caused by one of our machine gunners, Jackie Lynn. He was out to the right of our lines, where he could enfilade the whole ground in front of the German trenches. He was on his own, because his number 2 and 3 had conked out with the gas. He was firing away, and they had to drag him away from that gun, actually pull him away. When they got him back, he lasted about 3 days, then died of poison gas. But he got a Victoria Cross for what he did. More gas. Private W. Underwood, the 1st Canadian Division. It was a beautiful day, lying in a field writing to my mother. The sun was shining and the lark was singing high in the sky. Suddenly the bombardment started and we got orders to stand to. We went up the line in 2 columns, one either side of the road. As we reached the outskirts of the village of St. Julian, the bullets opened up. As I looked around, I counted just 32 men left on their feet out of the whole company of 227. The rest of us managed to jump into ditches, and that saved us from being annihilated. Then we saw coming towards us the French Zouaves, light infantry. They were in blue coats and red pants and caps. It was a revelation to us. We'd only seen khaki and drab uniforms. They were rushing towards us, half staggering, and we wondered what was the matter. We were a little perturbed at first. We tried to rally them, but they wouldn't stay. They were running away from the Germans. Then we got orders to shoot them down, which we did. We just turned round and shot them as they were running away. Then, as we looked further away, we saw this green cloud come slowly across the terrain. It was the first gas anybody had seen or heard of, and one of our boys, evidently a chemist, passed the word along that this was chlorine. Then he said, "If you urinate on your handkerchief, it will save your lungs." So most of us did that, and we tied the handkerchiefs round our faces. It saved us from being gassed. There were masses of Germans behind the gas cloud, their grey uniforms as plain as anything. And there we were, helpless, with our Ross rifles that we couldn't fire because they were always jammed. Destruction of Ypres. Trooper Stanley Down, North Somerset Yeomanry. On May 12, 1915, we arrived as the first streaks of dawn lit the sky. The bombardment went on from dawn until midday. The first shell came across and landed not too many yards from where I was standing. Sandbags, rifles and equipment went up into the air. After that, the bombardment began in earnest. Every minute the shells kept coming. The noise was terrific. By that time the trenches were just a quagmire. The earthworks and barbed wire had been blown to pieces long since. The result was that practically the whole of the front line around the town of Ypres was a series of holes in which men crouched, waiting for the end. And the photograph shows what was left of Ypres. Such an atrocity. Private W.A. Quinton, 2nd Battalion, Bedfordshire Fusiliers. The men came tumbling from their front line. I've never seen men so terror-stricken. They were tearing at their throats and their eyes were glaring out. Blood was streaming from those who were wounded, and they were falling over one another. Those who fell couldn't get up because of the panic of the men following them, and eventually they were piled up 2 or 3 high in this trench. One chap had his hand blown off, and his wrist was fumbling around, tearing at his throat. In fact, it was the most gruesome sight I'd seen in the war. When we got relieved, We made our way 5 miles back from the line. We were just a rabble. Then we passed an orchard where 200 or 300 men were reeling around, once again tearing at their throats, their faces black, while an RAMC sergeant stood by. And well, I've never known a man look so despondent. He said, "Look at the poor bastards, and we can't do a thing for them." Lieutenant Victor Hawkins, 2nd Battalion, Lancashire Fusiliers. The effect of the gas was to form a sort of foamy liquid in one's lungs, which would more or less drown you. A lot of men died pretty quickly, and others soon came down. They were in fact drowning from this beastly foam. Out of the 250 men we started with at 5 o'clock, we were very soon down to about 40 or 50 men. It was a nightmare. Sergeant Jack Dorgan, 7th Battalion, Northumberland Fusiliers. On April 26, during the attack on St Julian, a shell dropped right in amongst us. I found myself lying in the shell hole. There was another soldier who was unhurt, and we found 2 more just a few yards away. They had had their legs blown off. I will always remember their white thigh bones. The rest of their legs were gone. Private Jackie Oliver was one of them. I shouted out, "Tell Reedy Oliver his brother's been wounded." So Reedy came and stood looking at his brother, lying there with no legs. And a few minutes later, he watched him die. But the other fellow, Private Bob Young, was conscious to the last. I lay alongside of him and said, "Can I help you, Bob?" He said, "Straighten my legs, Jack." But he had no legs. I touched the bones and that seemed to satisfy him. And he said, "Get my wife's photograph out of my pocket." He couldn't move, he couldn't lift a finger, but somehow he held the photograph to his chest. And that's how Bob Young died. As we moved forward, we came across some Canadian soldiers who said the Germans had released gas. And when we had gone 100 yards, we encountered the gas. Our eyes were streaming with water and pain, so we bandaged each other's eyes. Anyone who could see would lead a line of half a dozen men, each with his hand on the shoulder of the one in front, back towards Ypres. When we got there, we went to the first aid station and lay down in a field. The day after, April 27, 1915, we were addressed by Sir John French, commanding officer of the British forces. He praised us for our bravery, but we thought little of him. We just felt, well, he's just come from his office somewhere miles away and he's praising us up now. What did he come here for? We just accepted it, but we didn't want it rubbed in. Learning to live in a trench. Fusilier Victor Packer, Royal Irish Fusiliers. I'd heard about the previous battles, but I couldn't get there fast enough. We had been brought up on the history of the Boer War, patriotism, heroics and everything. And we thought the war was going to be over before we could get there. However, in about half a minute, all that had gone. I wondered what the devil I'd got into, because it was nothing but mud and filth, and all the chaps who were already there, well, they looked like tramps, all plasters with filth and dirt, and unshaven. We couldn't dig trenches up there, because the ground was so soft and wet. We used to fill the sandbags, and to get water we used to gouge out a hole at the side of the trench in the bottom of the wall of sandbags and cover it with a piece of cardboard. In the morning it would be full of water, teeming with little black things, but boiling it killed all the bugs and it made a nice drop of tea. Once we attempted to shave it, but it was cold water, and it wasn't very clever because we couldn't light fires. If you smoked, you had to be very careful. If Jerry saw any smoke, he would send a grenade over because he knew there was someone there. The same thing would give you away. But we got clever at boiling a billy can. Believe it or not, with love letters from home, we would make spills of them. And if you kept a constant flame under it, you could make the water boil for tea. That was in the daytime. If it was at night, you had to cover it up with your coat or something. Then there were the rats. Huge bloody things. You wouldn't kill rats because you had no means of getting rid of them. They would putrefy and it would be worse. A full pack. Fusilier Victor Packer, the Royal Irish Fusiliers. The rats were huge. They were as big as cats or a small dog. I'm not exaggerating. Horrible great things. In the line we did 2 hours on and 4 hours off. And during the hours off, fatigues used to be carried out. And at night various tasks had to be done, such as filling sandbags, repairing damaged trenches and barbed wire and burying the dead. The unit came out of the line, crossed the canal and formed up on Menin Road and marched back to billets where Packer was out on his feet. Some of those marches back to billets used to be all of 20 kilometres, 12 and a half miles, and we used to be very bitter about the officers having horses to ride on. But we had to keep on with our old feet just the same. You got so that you still had, in those days, a full pack, 250 rounds of ammunition, water bottle, haversack, rifle, bayonet, and often you carried a bit of something extra as well. We were daft enough to carry souvenirs in those days, like nose caps of shells, or a Ulan's helmet, the light cavalry. Whatever we could get like that we prized, but not long afterwards we threw them over a hedge or somewhere. But we were so fatigued, and this takes a lot of believing. The whole battalion would be marching a column of fours, or what was left of them. They would be half strength, or less than that, and periodically you were halted, and the order came to fall out on the side of the road. Then the whistle blew, or they had to come shouting to wake you up and get you on your feet again. Those who could not get to the destination, they would send wagons back for the blokes who couldn't make it. Try to get wounded. Captain Maberly Esler, Royal Army Medical Corps, seen in the photograph. At first we found wounds were healing very well. Next day we looked at it, it was all inflamed again. After a time, the sister and I came to the conclusion they were doing this to prolong their stay in hospital. So we agreed to put a dressing over the inflammation so they couldn't get at it. A week later, it was healed perfectly. The first hut I had was occupied by 30 Sikhs, all with wounds to the palms of their hands. We came to the conclusion they must have held their hands up above the trench, so they would get shot through the hand and get invalided home. But never was any charge brought against them. For others, the mental condition was something varying between depression and relief at being out of the thing altogether. They were frightened, they were timid, they didn't want to go back again to the war, and very thankful to be in these sort of surroundings. In fact, when I said to one of them, I want to get out to go to the front, you have to have the experience. He said, you want to go to the front, you must be bloody mad. And that gave me an inkling that things weren't very pleasant out there. Firing squads. Rifleman Henry Williamson, the London Rifle Brigade. While I was at Armentières, I was detailed to form part of a firing squad at the execution of a deserter. He was tied to a post against a wall in his civilian clothes, and we were told to fire at the piece of white cloth pinned over his heart. We didn't know what the rifles were loaded with. Some were loaded with ball, others were blank. Then we had the order to fire and pull the trigger. We knew by the recoil if it was loaded with ball or not. Then the deserter's name was read out on 3 successive parades as a warning. Corporal Alan Gray. I was warned that 6 of us had to go on a firing party to shoot 4 men of another battalion who had been accused of desertion. I didn't think an Englishman should be shooting another Englishman. We were in France to fight the Germans. Anyway, later in the evening, an old soldier in another battery told me that there was one thing in the army that you could refuse to do. So straight away I went back to the sergeant and said, "I'm sorry, I'm not doing this." And I heard no more about it. I think one reason why I felt so strongly about it was the fact that the week before, a boy in our own battalion had been shot for desertion. I knew that boy, and I knew that he had absolutely lost his nerve. He couldn't have gone back in the line. Anyway, he was shot. And the tragedy of it was that a few weeks later, in our local paper, I saw that his father had joined up to avenge his son's death on the Germans. VD and Rats. Private Thomas McIndoe, 12th Battalion, the Middlesex Regiment. See the photograph. When we arrived in France, a memo was issued by Lord Kitchener which said that in recent months quite a number of the expeditionary force had rendered themselves unfit for duty through negligence in contracting venereal disease. When we got to number 1 rest camp on the hill at Le Havre, I saw different units digging pits and sweating profusely. In conversation with one of the inmates, they were undergoing a course of treatment, a German treatment named 606, which required an injection of mercury into the system. This mercury apparently took effect quicker if the victim overheated his body and so rid himself of this complaint. Private Thomas McIndoe, 12th Battalion, the Middlesex Regiment. Rats, oh crikey. If they were put in a harness, they could have done a milk round. They were that big, yet honest. Nearly every morning, a bloody great thing would come and stand up on its back legs and gnaw at something. I used to line the sights up and give them 1 round of ball, bang, and blow them to nothing. The Battle of Loos, September 25th to October 10th. Corporal Edward Glendenning, 12th Battalion, Notts and Derby Regiment, the Sherwood Foresters. During the night of September 24th, we moved up into reserve trenches. As we came up, we passed through many squadrons of British cavalry. We didn't get any sleep all night, because even before we got there, our artillery barrage was blazing away. It was a long, dreary, miserable night. Some chaps were crying, some praying, but most of us were optimistic. As soon as it was light, we were issued with a big ration and rum. It was 2 hours before we got the order to advance. We found ourselves walking over bodies of men who had fallen and wounded men trying to find a shell hole to hide in. All of a sudden they opened on us with terrific machine gun fire. I sensed we were getting fewer and fewer. We took the second line of their trenches, devastated by our artillery. Then the Germans realised where we were and started sweeping us with machine gun fire. Then they opened up with whiz-bangs. We lost the platoon sergeant and corporal with direct hits. At dusk we were relieved by a detachment of the Guards. Word was passed along for the Sherwood Foresters to withdraw, coming back over ground that had been captured, the sight that met our eyes was unbelievable. Imagine a flock of sheep sleeping in a field. The bodies were as thick as that. Some were still alive and were crying out, begging for water. One hefty chap grabbed me. "Water, water," he cried. I was about to take the cork out of the water bottle when the man behind me said, "Get on, we're going to get lost in no man's land." So I broke away, running to catch up with the man in front. Hill 70, Bethune. Sergeant Charles Lippert, 8th Battalion, Queen's Royal West Surrey Regiment. Our baptism of fire was our attack on Hill 70 in the Bethune area. We advanced in short, sharp rushes, and everywhere men were falling. My biggest shock in advancing up the hill was to come across my own platoon officer, Lieutenant Cressy, lying dead or wounded. I remember shaking him, but of course he was dead. There was no one to give us orders. They had all been killed or wounded. I was carrying 60 pounds of weight, so I got the man next to me to cut it off with his jackknife. We did the same for all the men. In the meantime, we were still firing. As we approached the wire, I could see bodies of men hanging on it, dead or badly wounded. Our artillery had not cut the wire, even firing 18-pounder shells at it. So there was no way of getting through the wire at all. I couldn't even see where the enemy trench was. The barbed wire was so thick and deep. Well, we lay down, and how many men there were at the time, I don't know, but it was very few indeed. We lay there wondering what on earth to do, until some bright spark said, "We've got the order to retire." No, I didn't fancy going down that hill again with my back to the Jerrys. It was bad enough coming up in front, but I knew there was a sunken trench to the right of us. So I got the few men that were around me back into this trench, and temporarily at least we were out of fire. Well, how long we lay there, I don't know, but I realised that we had made a mess of the thing, or at least someone had, and we were all cut up. I was never going to forget Hill 70. King George V. Corporal Edward Glendenning, 12th Battalion, Notts and Derby Regiment, the Sherwood Foresters. In the autumn of 1950, we had orders we were going to be inspected by someone high up. We didn't know who it was. We set off and marched about 15 miles, where we found a lot of other units already assembled. We took our places and waited for about 4 hours. The high-ups got out of their cars and proceeded to mount their chargers. An orderly was flying a miniature royal standard behind the king, who rode along the first 4 ranks, speaking to an officer here and there. Our instructions had been at the conclusion of the parade. We were to put our caps on the points of our fixed bayonets and wave and cheer. So that's what we did. Hip, hip, hooray. Well, the king's horse reared and he fell off. He just seemed to slide off. So of course, the second hip, hip fizzled out. It was quite a fiasco, and you should have seen the confusion as the other high-ranking officers rushed to dismount and go to the king's assistance. They got him up, and the last we saw of him was being hurriedly driven away. Newspapers were not welcome. Lieutenant Ulrich Burke, 2nd Battalion, Devonshire Regiment. When we did read the newspapers, it made us angry, especially if you had done a big raid on a battalion scale, which would be 200 yards wide, and you had penetrated the enemy to the depth of about half a mile and brought back prisoners. Then you read in the paper, no action on the Western Front. It didn't seem to warrant, where you'd lost probably 50 men killed and an equal number wounded, and mention it wasn't big enough, even though the war hadn't been on 2 years. It used to annoy everybody terribly. Very little action on the Western Front. Private Clifford Lane, 1st Battalion, the Hertfordshire Regiment. I can remember that one of my comrades got wounded, and this induced in me a sense of desolation, which would normally only come if you lost a very close family member. There is a feeling of comradeship which couldn't be understood by anybody unless they were actually in the front line in the war. It was the sort of trust between men that very rarely occurs. Gallipoli. Private Walter Staples, the 3rd Australian Battalion, 1st Australian Division. It was pitch dark, then all of a sudden a dim outline of a coast loomed. We were all beginning to get tensed up, nervous, wondering what was going to happen. Then a single shot rang out, and a yellowish light flared up in the sky. From then on the Turks let loose, machine guns and rifle fire at the boats. The pinnacles, light pinnaces, light boats, cast us off. The muffled oarsmen took up the row. As soon as the boats grounded, it was every man for himself. Do the best you could. As we scrambled ashore, those that were lucky enough to get there, we lay there under a cliff, slipped off our packs, fixed bayonets, and someone in the crowd, there was no officer, shouted, "Right lads, after the bastards." Private Frank Bent, 2nd Australian Brigade, 1st Australian Division. There were dead and wounded of the 3rd Brigade all around, and we scampered as hard as we could to a little bit of shelter. We dumped the shovels and picks. We'd had enough of them. Somebody said, "Up you go," and away we went up the slope. It wasn't too bad, but halfway up somebody shouted out to me, "Alan Corden has stopped one." Alan was one of my best pals, and that made me feel a bit better, because if they'd got Alan, I felt, I'm going to get them. Mass killing. Marine Joe Clement, Deal Battalion, Royal Marine Light Infantry. Eventually we made the rocky ground of the first reach. I fixed up my Maxim machine gun behind the sandbags at the end of a gully, then sat and waited. It was still dark when we heard the trumpets blowing us as the Turks came at us in droves from the other end of the gully, from where we were positioned. I didn't have to take aim, I just fired and mowed them down. You couldn't miss, there were so many of them. It was like firing into a mass of bodies gelled together. Eventually they withdrew. But they came again 7 times that night, and each time we drove them back. Come the dawn, they had gone. Only the bodies were left. Private Walter Stables, 3rd Australian Battalion. On the morning when the attack came, they came over in 2 great waves from their trenches, in great hulking mass. They were rather big men, the Turks, a fine body of men. As they came over, they were shouting Allah and blowing their trumpets and whistling and shouting like schoolboys. As they got closer, within nice rifle range, we had the order to fire, and we opened up with rapid fire and brought them down in hundreds. Hundreds of them fell, and in front of our trenches. I should think when the attack was over, there would be anything from 2,000 to 3,000 dead or dying in front of our brigade. Aussies suffered most. Private Frank Bent, 2nd Australian Brigade. There was no coordinated effort about it. just a crowd of diggers working with each other, trust each other blind. After we'd been digging a while, the Queen Elizabeth let go 3 of her shells. The sound was a real tonic. One bloke shouted out, "Share that amongst you, you bastards." The bloke next to me was Robbie Robinson, a corporal in my battalion. I can see him now, grinning all over his face. And the next thing, his head fell on my shoulder. A sniper had got him through the jugular vein. Robbie's blood was all over my cheek. The photograph is of Australian soldiers who took the brunt of casualties at Gallipoli, attending a wounded friend. None have steel helmets, which were not issued until 1916. Battle of Krithia, May 6, 1915. Marine Joe Clement, Teal Battalion, Royal Marine Light Infantry. I had my machine gun trained on Krithia, which was 1,000 yards away, a road used by mule trains. We would fire and make the mules jump about a bit, but at night we were sometimes told not to fire in certain directions because we had patrols out. One night the Gurkhas were out there, so we were keeping a close watch. Out of the dark came this voice to warn us not to shoot. "All right, Tommy, all right." Then I saw this smiling face coming in, and it wasn't until he got into the trench that I realised he was carrying the head of a Turk. He had used his kukri, the short, curved sword. See the photograph. Private Horrell Bolton, 1st Battalion London Regiment. One of the biggest curses was flies. Millions and millions of flies. The whole side of the trench used to be one black swarming mass. If you opened a tin of Bully Bee, it would be swarming with flies. Open a tin of jam and swarms of flies went straight into it. They were round your mouth, in any cuts and sores, which then turned septic. If you bared any part of your body, you were immediately smothered. It was a curse, it really was. Attack on Turkish lines, June the 4th, 1915. Ordinary Seaman Joe Murray, Hood Battalion, Royal Naval Division. We stood there, packed like sardines, unable to stand up in comfort. Another hour before we went over the top, a long hour. Some men were fast asleep on their feet. The lad next to me checked his rifle and ammunition at least 10 times. Still not satisfied. At 11:30, our guns ceased fire. Many lives depended upon that 30-minute bombardment. Had it destroyed the Turkish machine gun post? Of course, I'd advanced before, many times. I didn't like it, but I wasn't afraid of Johnny Turk. These were my thoughts as I stood beside Lieutenant Commander Parsons, my company commander, waiting for him to blow his whistle. "Are you ready? Come on, boys, off we go." I scrambled over the top, asking God to help me. Many, many men were killed as soon as they showed their heads and fell back into the trench. Poor Lieutenant Commander Parsons only got a few yards. Very few of us reached the Turkish front line. Even fewer got to the second. Suddenly I felt a bang in the chest. Then I found myself crawling about on the bottom of the trench, trying to find my rifle. My face was stiff. I could only see out of one eye. I eventually found my rifle and realised that all my equipment had been torn to shreds. My tunic was smouldering. My body was crisscrossed with rips and all the ammunition had gone. Apparently, a machine gun sweep had caught me and blown the lot off, and down I went. After some distance, I managed to get to my feet. I remember crawling quite a long way. Suvla Beach, St. Sherwood. We landed on Suvla Beach, and all that first day we were lying there with no orders to attack. I kept in touch with my colonel. I was one of the chief runners who took down messages. By the time we reached Point 100, our objective, our casualties had mounted terrifically. The colonel said, "You must go down and find the Brigadier General." The message was, "Have reached Point 100. Casualties very heavy." When I reached the Brigadier General, who said, "We haven't been in action 2 or 3 hours yet," it was impossible. A few minutes later, a Lincolnshire runner arrived with the same tale. Their casualties were about 75%. The General looked at the Brigadier General and said, "My God, this must be true." Hell on earth. Ordinary Seaman Jack Gearing, Benbow Battalion, Royal Naval Division. We knew that the 400 men of the East Yorks were mostly fresh from training, and only a few had seen action. So every sailor was given 2 soldiers to look after. We gave them our hammocks, made sure they ate well, and gave them our rum. You see, we knew that where they were going would be like hell on earth. That's why I admire the British. They take it and they're quiet. As we approached Suvla Bay on the night of August 6th to 7th, 1915, it was the darkness before the dawn. As the soldiers followed each other, one got hit by a sniper and screamed out. I told him to shut up and put up with the pain. Each day when there was a lull, we'd go and collect the wounded. Some of them were terribly badly wounded. I did my best to cheer them up, but most of the time I was quiet because there wasn't much you could say in the face of all that horror. Every Sunday we used to have a service on board, and we sang hymns which were heard by the soldiers on shore. They told us how much it meant to them, so whenever we scrubbed the decks, we sang out as loud as we could. Old hymns like "Onwards Christian Soldiers" and "Fight the Good Fight," anything that was rousing. It cheered us up too. I saw quite a lot of Turkish prisoners on shore. They were badly dressed and always wanted our boots. They were so poor, but they were wonderful fighting men. They didn't give way. We could see them fighting from the ship. They were good. We didn't feel any anger towards them. We had respect for them. Burnt Hill. Fusilier W. Flynn, 1st Royal Munster Fusiliers. When we advanced, see the photograph, the Turks stood up on their trenches and waved us on. It was hopeless, hopeless. They set fire to all the gorse bushes, and it was called Chocolate Hill. Later they called it Burnt Hill. So many of the wounded got burned. We did get black towards the end. We weren't succeeding at all. All we were doing was losing a lot of men and ships. Every day we were bringing in different men, different faces, all tired, all big. It was so hot that summer, so hot. Then, as autumn came on, we knew things were getting worse on land. Even with the reinforcements, we were watching a picture of failure, fought out by brave men. When we withdrew on December 20th, it was dark. Evacuation. Fusilier W. Flynn, 1st Royal Munster Fusiliers. The soldiers were all packed so tight and quiet in the barges, making their way to the big ships. We never lost a man, which was remarkable. As we were steaming quietly away, I thought of what Pincher Martin, who had done 20 years in the Navy, had said to me a few days after we'd arrived at Suvla Bay. "We're not going to be flying the Union Jack here." He was right. We were never going to make it ours. Marine Joe Clement, Royal Marine Light Infantry. There was continuous rain which filled up the trenches, so we had to sleep on the parapets on the edge. The Turks did the same. We had an unspoken truce and didn't shoot at sleeping men, but it was so cold and we were always wet, never dry. On Christmas Day we were in the firing line and were served one slice of pudding and 7 dates. 2 days later we went down into our dugout to change our clothes, only to find our packs with our clean washing under 3 feet of water. Then another trip. They put us in the firing line for New Year's Day. The first we knew about the evacuation was when the French moved out on January 1st, 1916. We didn't know that Anzac and Suvla beaches had already been evacuated. On January 8th, we destroyed food and rifles that were not needed. We tied empty sandbags around our feet, secured water bottles so that they wouldn't clank around, and moved off at midnight. I carried my machine gun for 5 miles until we reached the beach. As we were walking, Asiatic Annie fired several shells. We hated him throughout our time in Gallipoli. The Turks didn't know we were going, firing from the Asiatic side. Annie had always been a law unto herself. Thoughts of an extraordinary seaman. Ordinary Seaman Joe Murray, Hood Battalion, Royal Naval Division. I thought to myself, I don't like sneaking away like this after all this bloody trouble. I was really distressed in my mind. I thought to myself, we're stealing away, we stole away from Blandford, stole away from Egypt, and now we're stealing away from Gallipoli. I remember when I came towards Backhouse Post, I thought to myself, oh dear me, poor old Yates and Parsons, all killed and buried here. When we first went to Backhouse Post, I remember how happy and anxious we were to get stuck into the Turks. And now here we are, only a handful left, as we got further from the line near Backhouse Post. I remembered the advance we had on May 6, 1915, when more of my pals died, such as Petty Officer Warren and young Yates. I could still hear young Horton crying for his mother as he died, and I remembered Colonel Quilter, a great big chap, as straight as a poker, ex-guards officer. I remembered him leading the advance and going to his death armed with a huge walking stick. He told us when we were on the boat, just before we landed, that the eyes of the world would be upon us. Well, the eyes of the Turks certainly were, and so were their rifles, but the rest of the world seemed to have forgotten us. Ordinary Seaman Joe Murray, Hood Battalion, Royal Naval Division. The tears were streaming down my cheeks. I just couldn't restrain them. My eyes were smarting so much, I think I walked the rest of the way with my eyes closed. I knew it so well, though. I couldn't go wrong. We were packed like sardines in this blinking lighter. That was a flat-bottomed barge. We were so packed we couldn't move our hands up at all. And it was dark, of course. Apart from being dark outside, it was dark inside. There were no lights and no portholes. A couple of fellows behind me were pushing and shoving, and all of a sudden the damn thing started to rock. There must have been a shell drop pretty close. There were hundreds of us in this lighter, and then all of a sudden it hit the pier. Those that were asleep were half awake, and those that were sick were still being sick. And oh dear me, it was stifling hot. Then another shell came along, and I thought to myself, why the hell don't we get out of here? It may have only been a little while, but it seemed like hours. Then eventually we felt the slow rocking, and I thought to myself, well, here we are, we're at sea now, anyhow. We've been dumped into this lighter like a lot of cattle and just pushed out to sea, and nobody gave a tinker's cuss whether we lived or died. I hope you have enjoyed my story on the Great War. These men were fighting and dying so that we could be free. Our thanks go to them, and they can never be enough.